Hello, everyone. We're going to get this started. One of our presenters is running a little late. We're going to start anyway, hoping that he will appear agreeing to speak. I'm Berlin Carr. Please welcome. I'm a professor at Central Connecticut State, and welcome to Revisionist History. The Connecticut Literary Festival is produced and curated by the English Department at Central Connecticut State with support from the Connecticut Humanities. We have special thanks, very obviously, to Real Art Galleries, because it's such a wonderful venue, for this celebration of literature and thinking in society. Also to RJ Julia Bookstore and all of our corporate and individual sponsors. We could not do any of this without their financial assistance. And please, if it's possible, consider supporting the festival yourself. After today's literary carnival, the festival will continue to promote the literary arts through their reading series promoted by the Connecticut Book Award finalists and the Connecticut Anthology and the virtual literature talk series. It's information on the website, so you'll look at that. After the panel, please continue this conversation outside in the signing tent with the panelists. I'm going to try to stop somewhat on time because there are others scheduled for this week. Now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of our panel. That's Ines Rivera, and her poetry collection, Love Letter to an Afterlife, was a finalist for the 2019 International Latino Book Awards and the 2019 Bloomington University Festival of Poetry. Her work has appeared in the American Poetry Review, Caribbean Quarterly, New Letters, the New York Times Magazine, and Small. She's an assistant professor at the University. I'm happy.
Hello and welcome to the panel Revisionist Histories, the necessary reimagining of literature as a cultural record. I'm Ines, and I'd like to introduce Grossberg and Buitron, my fellow panelists as well. I'm a poet, I'm a Caribbeanist, and I'm also a Revisionist. And I lead with this information because the interdisciplinary nature of this panel, I think, makes it a pretty exciting one. I'm somebody who looks at texts in different languages and also utilizes texts from different disciplines to interpret literature. So I look at history and literature often together. I've prepared some introductory remarks and I promise to be brief. Writers have the difficult task of probing through a nation's memory. Whether that memory is in official documents, myths, fiction, poetry, music, or other cultural productions. They tackle this task so that history better reflects the lived realities of a diverse majority. Edward Glissant, the poet and philosopher from Martinique, affirms that capital H history, what we know as official or Western history, has been predominantly written by white elite men. As a result, it possesses gaps and silences because it left out lowercase histories. So, for example, the histories of enslaved individuals, the histories of women, or any individual who doesn't fulfill rigid notions of identity. Capital H history possesses its own inherent biases and elements of conflict, much like literature. History involves creativity on the part of writers who reimagine a past that was too often wiped out. Revisionist histories, then, can fill in the ruptures instigated by colonialism or its legacies, or even patriarchy. To quote Glissant, history as consciousness at work and history as lived experience are therefore not the business of historians exclusively. In other words, literature can help produce a fuller and more accurate begin exploring and debating this relationship between history and literature. We will first hear from our panelists, and I will then, I'm going to introduce each one, and then I will briefly read, just for the sake of time, and we'll have a discussion and we'll lead to a Q&A. Benjamin Grossberg, is the author of My Husband Would. It won a Forward Indies Book of the Year award, and it also recently today was announced that it won the Connecticut Literary Book Award for poetry. His collection, Sweet Court Orchard, is a winner of the Lambda Literary Award. He is the director of creative writing at the University of Hartford, and I'm proud to say he's also my colleague. Please welcome him.
Thank you all for coming, for putting together this panel. When I was thinking about the questions that Ines put together for us, I thought about history as we think about it as a kind of monolithic thing, and canonical literature, capital H history, capital C canonical literature, as being very similar. The received privileged stories that a culture tells itself to understand itself. So I'm going to make 3 points and I'm going to share a poem. So that was the first point, that the historical and the disrupt, the canonical are really the same project. 2, I come to this panel from the perspective of a gay man. I was around the academy in the 90s when queer studies was first exploding. And back then there was a lot of wrangling because QIA identities are really contemporary ways of organizing and understanding the self. The question isn't whether there's something essential underneath these identities, but how that essential thing is fashioned into a self, into an identity. So, given my background, to me it always seems like a kind of willful misreading to write what we think of as queer identity, or even heterosexual identity, into the past. That those are really contemporary constructions. So we say to queer a text, to make it queer, something you're doing to it, but a necessary doing, and often a delightful one. And the third thing I want to say is that when I look to do this work, it has involved looking back in canonical literature to find queerness in the silences, the spaces which gesture toward undefined difference, especially in terms of desire. So, okay, now it's the fun part. I'm going to share a poem. Most people know Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. My little horse must think it queer. That seems like enough, right? That's the kind of sight that queering zeroes in on. Why I gave my harness bells a shake. So, dramatic monologue from the horse's point. Why I gave my harness bells a shake. I knew that there was no mistake. We were always stopping, and not, of course, for my convenience. Not that I mind a good canter in winter, especially late mornings, the sun reflecting up from a snowy road, the feel of my hooves breaking its crust. And even better once I get moving, just hoof crunch, harness bell, wind, and downy flake rushing past my ears. In those moments, you forget the driver and being driven, forget even the effort of motion. You're just another moving thing, the wind like a water current pushing you on. But our rides were rarely like that. For one thing, they were freighted by promises. How his promises became my problem, I'm not sure. But by harness and whip, they did. He didn't often mention the whip. We'd start after sunset, guaranteeing a late return with little time to wipe me down. I'd shiver to sleep under rough wool, watching his lantern disappear behind a barn door. And they'd drive us far into North Country, those promises. Him with parcels or packets of letters, slipping inside for a while, only to return laughing, breath rich with coffee, sugar, usually brandy. I'd smell it when he'd come alongside, a white puff in my face as he checked the bit and patted my side before lifting a foot to the cart, heaving himself up. My point is, when he wanted to stop, we did. My concerns, a horse of a different color. There were spots beautiful to me, too. I got enough of fields filling with snow, but sometimes sunset, late August, turning purple over evergreens, the sky, or a river, the cool bubbling on my hoofs, just imagining it. And orchards, October studding the ground with windfalls, halving one with a single crunch and feeling the drip down my chin, licking my tongue around my sticky muzzle. That is, if I wasn't wearing a bit, and of course, if we had stopped. Bottom line, I shook the bells because I wanted to get home. Oat bag, blanket, straw mound, eyes closing. Once, this was years ago, at the edge of my pasture, I saw a man, mid-40s, careworn, lingering at the fence. And when I wandered over, he extended his arm to me, palm facing up. In it, 4 cubes of sugar, like dice, like we were about to make a bet. I understood at once to bite gently, with just the edge of my teeth. My lips brushing his calloused palm, my nostrils filling with the dark sugar and human sweat. I sometimes recall it, that singular touch, before I sleep.
Our next panelist is Buitron. Victoria is a writer and translator who hails from Ecuador and resides in Connecticut. She received an MFA in creative writing from Fairfield University. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Lost Balloon, X-Ray Lit Mag, Entropy, Bending Genres, and other literary magazines. Her debut memoir and essays, A Body Across Two Hemispheres, is the 2021 Fairfield Book Prize winner, and it will be available in spring 2022 by Woodhall Press. Please welcome Victoria.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's an honor to be here with both of you today. I was thinking about what to read today, and up until last night I had a very concrete idea, and of course this morning I completely changed my mind. So I decided to read this essay from my upcoming book called Undocumented. The UN in the beginning of undocumented is in parentheses because I'm not undocumented. I created this with a lot of inspiration from my husband, who was undocumented for more than a decade, from watching the news, from so many things around me. And when Sharon McCullum, who picked this memoir as the winner, she just described my book and a lot of the essays as documentary collage. And I had not heard of that beforehand, and then it stuck, and I was like, wow, yeah, this is what I'm doing. I didn't even know I was doing this, but I'm doing it, right? Okay, so here goes nothing. Undocumented. Animals. These are not people. These are animals. The 45th President of the United States. The administration tries to clarify that those words refer to only some migrants, but I know he means all of us. And so I wait for fangs to replace my teeth, look over to my husband as we wake, and wonder if that will be the day I see a huddle of spider eyes have sprouted on his forehead. I wait for my dad to tell me he has grown a tail, for my husband's uncle to say fish skin has flourished in the spaces between his fingers, and that the ocean beckons him, his hands now fins. For friends who have crossed the border to tell me that their toes are morphing into the tuft of hooves. I wait and wait and wait, not realizing that for many, we've been animals even before we were born. B is for bopet. Biaxially oriented polyethylene terephthalate is the material of the emergency blanket that was developed for NASA and is commonly known as Mylar. Uses on Earth. Stabilize runner's temperature after a marathon, melt snow, create a shelter, insert into gloves and boots while hiking to insulate from the cold, use as a signaling device when lost in the woods, reflect heat, give to detained brown children at the border for them to stay warm while they wonder if they'll see their mothers again. It may only weigh 1.75 ounces, but have you ever felt the heaviness of a blanket that isn't yours? C is for citizenship. Abridged list of alternative questions for the U.S. naturalization test. Number 1. How many times does the word alien appear in federal documents and laws? Number 2. How much does it cost to build a wall, fence, and visible demarcation along the U.S.-Mexico border? Number 3. How long has ICE been in existence? Number 4. Say another word that begins with the word alien that is not alienate. Number 5. List antonyms to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Number 6. Describe the 100-mile border zone. Number 7. What is the definition of freedom of movement according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Number 8. How many children have been separated from their guardians at the border? Number 9. Approximately how many undocumented individuals reside in the United States? Number 10. Who is Gilberto Francisco Ramos Juarez? D is for dreamer. Fill out paperwork. Send $495 to the U.S. government. Get your fingerprints done in another state because it's the closest location. Wait until the police background check goes through. Get a card in the mail. It's not a green card, but a work permit in red, white, and blue, like the country's flag that has formed you but not birthed you. Avoid getting parking tickets. Don't bump into any cops, and leave whenever a fight breaks out at a bar. Lawyer's orders, right? You don't want to be implicated. At work, don't use the word undocumented. Pretend your childhood was just like Kathy's, who sits in the cubicle across from you and has lived in the same house her entire life. Accept that you can't think about 5 or 10 years down the line because you need to renew your DACA application every 2 years. And let's face it, maybe DACA will be rescinded. Then there won't be a cubicle with your name on it anymore. Sometimes you question whether a path that ends is better than no path at all. E is for esperar, to wait. While David waits for paperwork, David is my husband, to be processed throughout the years, he trudges on. Some moments he's painfully aware of the possibility of deportation looming over him. Throughout others, the uncertainty fades into the background. He meets with friends from Costa Rica on a rooftop in New York City to talk about moments from long ago that involve scraped knees and soccer matches on hot pavement. We visit museums where there are off-kilter sculptures of debris within luggage and where we can eat the art. We have a cupcake fight with David's guardians, ending his birthday with smears of cake on our cheeks and icing trickling into the crevices of our ears while our chuckles persist. He spends the weekend drifting around a track, the flecks of tires burned off and embedded into his forehead. In the moments that he waits, there is love and laughter and hope. Thank you.
I'm going to read a poem from a collection that I'm working on called How to Swallow a River. But it's really, I'm writing a number of poems that really extend some of the ideas that I dealt with in my first poetry collection, Love Letter to an Afterlife. In the revisionist histories that I, quote unquote, generate or produce, I'm really interested in complicating the way that we think of a little island called Hispaniola, shared by Dominican Republic and Haiti. The relationship between these two nations is often understood as a quote unquote cockfight. It's a battle to the death, it's perpetual, it's a battle for control of the island, and it's been ongoing for centuries. I'm among scholars and writers who find that the cockfight narrative is problematic because it silences moments of cooperation, collaboration, and cross-pollination on an island shared by two countries. So there's two allusions that I just want to explain in my poem. The first one is to the Massacre River, or the Dahabon River, which essentially divides these two nations. And it gained its name, the Massacre River, after the 1937 massacre, which was a genocide of 20 to 30,000 or more Haitian and Dominican Haitians. It was a massacre ordered by Rafael Trujillo, the dictator at the time, and it was largely silenced in history. The second allusion that I'll tell you about is the word perejil, which in Spanish means parsley. And it's a widely held belief that this term, perejil, was used as a shibboleth, a kind of litmus test to decide who lived and who died, based on how they could pronounce this word, right? But I should emphasize, one, it happened, but it's not as widely practiced as people think. What I really want to emphasize, though, is that this was an attack on a very unique community, a nation apart from Haiti and the DR, a bicultural, bi-ethnic, bilingual community where people very often spoke both languages. So in this poem, I thought it would be interesting to imagine these two nations as lovers. And I encourage you to think about these two nations as a kind of, as twins, right? And this idea of twinning, it doesn't negate that conflicts abound, right? But I do think that it acknowledges the connections between the human beings that live in these nations and along this border area. So the poem is called La cama tiene candela, or the bed is on fire. Would you believe me if I told you she loved me? She loved me even with perejil on her breath. She said I was her garden of hibiscus, of Bayaibe roses. She kissed my forehead. A bell was ringing, a light flickered, and in it our arms, the same deep brown like wet earth cradling the Massacre River. Would you believe me if I told you she slept beside me every night, since gliding her finger across my teeth to memorize my smile? The landscape cloaked in plum and restless, but she'd say sleeping with me was like swaying in tall grass, under the moon sun, pelicans preening nearby. She professed she loved me tonight, tomorrow night, yesterday too. Over and over the lap of jade waves. Come, she'd say, into this field of soft seagrass perfumed with charcoal, perfumed with rosemary, a row of palms for shade. Believe a love like this is possible, that I could follow music in her voice beside a drumming in mine, that my sugar tamed the salt of her words. To sleep she begged beside the only person she ever loved. She said this with perejil rolling off her tongue, a tongue promising to gift me cetaceans, jellyfish scars, starfish rings, sometimes blood. A tongue that convinced me sleep is a gentle swing, gentle back and forth, a tangle of our toes, tangle of fingers, tangle of snake birds in borderless places we played before. Believe me, we rewrote the story of our island. We laughed in bed, debating if we were two wings from the same bird, or the bird itself. Thank you. Just to start the discussion portion of this panel. In my introductory remarks, I referenced the work of Buitron, and Buitron's arguments suggest a blurring of the border between history and literature, where writers become historians. Do you agree with Buitron? Are writers historians? And as an extension of this question, can the border between history and literature collapse completely? I know, that's a lot, yeah.
It is a lot. Thankfully, Ines showed us the questions beforehand. That's what we'd be breaking out on my forehead. So when I thought about this, To the question that came to me in response was, can writers be historians? Well, aren't historians just writers? In other words, when I started to think about the difference, what collapsed was not the work that we do, but the work that they do. What does it mean to think about historians as writers? Well, one of the challenges to me is that, it destabilizes the past in a way which, especially if you have some kind of position or authority vested in the past, is going to be very threatening. So I thought, that would be a reason that maybe society as a whole would resist thinking about just how much an act of creation writing a history is. I mean, we've all heard the cliche that the victor writes the history, and, that's often used to think about a kind of aggressive stance. But even in the most intentionally sort of benign applications, the victor is still writing the history, right? Even if the attempt is to be as unbiased, as unideological as possible. It seems to me that one can't get away from all of the victor assumptions that inform the writing. So I did think about how both have the basis in fact, history and literature, one having the basis in sort of truth as it played out in real events, the other having perhaps a basis in the truth of human emotions and human heart. But it seemed to me in the final application, there's really not much difference between the work that history does and the work that literature does. So I thought, yes, that the only thing that needs to happen for historians, for writers to become historians, is not necessarily changing the work that writers do, but us as a society understanding more critically the work that historians do. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay, so for the first part of your question, the answer is definitely yes. And as soon as I read this question, when you sent it over to us, the three books that came to mind, the first one was Lately Long Soldiers Whereas, where she takes an official document by the United States, a recent document where they apologize for the atrocities that were done to indigenous communities around the United States. So she takes this literal document and she dissects it in her book, Whereas, and when I first read it, I was just blown away that she could do this. And she uses also a lot of white space, a lot of columns, and it's just a response to maybe this isn't really the apology that we need. So that was the first book that came to mind, where I feel like the borders between literature and history collapse. The second example that also came to mind was DMZ Colony by Dawn Mi Choi, which won the National Book Award. And again, she uses images from her own childhood, and she uses U.S. history and South Korean history to tell a story not just about her family, but about her culture. And the last book that came to mind was The Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, because even though this book is about her life and about being undocumented, a huge portion of it interviews and also describes a lot of the deaths during 9/11 from the undocumented point of view, which I think is not something that you really read about in history books, the ones that are taught in elementary schools or high schools. So after I thought about these three books, I was like, what do they have in common? Yes, they're all women. You can say that they're all minorities. So based on what you said about the victor, I think that a lot of people nowadays, these are all recent books, are using historical documents or history to say, hey, I'm not voiceless. I've always had a voice, but I've just not necessarily had the platform to tell my history. And I feel like these are three writers that are doing that. But it's also hard because who's giving that platform? Is it the victors of history that are now ceding a platform to these individuals?
I agree with both Ben and Victoria. And I mean, the point that I'll make is that obviously the methodology is different, right? And I feel like writers actually have an even bigger task, right? In my own research, I come across texts and even documents that purposely left people out, and those are histories that there's only one way to actually get them back, is to reimagine them. So I think on the part of writers, the methodology is different, and I think the task is enormous. I'll also just kind of underscore that, there's a book by Evelyn Trujillo. It's called The Infamous Rosalie. And what that book does beautifully is that it envisions the story of a maroon woman. When I say maroon, it means that the woman eventually becomes a runaway slave and rebels against the institution of slavery. And what it does so beautifully in that book is something that history often lacks. It puts a face, it puts a personal story to that kind of history, right? So that she doesn't just become part of this like anonymous mass. And I think that's the real power of literature when you put it beside something like capital H history, is that it personalizes these stories. So that these constructions, for example, that Ben was referring to before his reading, they become dismantled, right? It's very hard to reinforce rigid notions of identity, for example, if you see somebody more as a human being, as somebody, for example, like myself, who can be 2 or 3 things at the same time, right? Who can be both Dominican, Afro-Dominican, and Argentine, and American, right? And still has family members who are also Dominican Haitians. So I think the methodology is different, and I'll just say that writers, I think, have a much harder task in the way that they rewrite history, right? Because they have to literally dig through gaps and silences, and often that comes with a kind of trauma that's hard to dig through.
Just to briefly respond,
Yeah.
when you say that, it really makes me think about how, in some ways, the revisionist historian and the writer going back, what did you say, reimagining people into history are really team players. That, what the revisionist historian is doing under the banner of objective truth, right, that's history's claim to fame. That the writer is doing under the banner of sort of the heart and the body. That the history is sort of putting it into the heads of, okay, this existed in fact, and the writer is putting it into the breath and the heart and the soul. Feel those narratives with me.
I will also say, there's oral histories, I think, are really doing like bridging those 2 sides in really interesting ways. Because it brings the historian together with a person who tells you their story, and the idea is that in their testimony, they will most likely reveal something about an event or experience in history. But the historian also takes these kinds of liberties, and they can draw from just different narrative techniques to really bring that person's story to life. Second question?
Can I ask it sort of just a question?
Sure, yeah.
So, when I was thinking about this, part of what I was wondering about do these questions sort of inflect differently for marginalized peoples of color and queer people? Because queer identity is very hard to read back into the past, right? I mean, in some ways, it's a sort of we're importing the current technology of how we understand ourselves back 200 years, 300 years before it was necessarily invented, right? I mean, as we currently constitute them, homosexuality and heterosexuality are really late 19th century sorts of things. But with people of color, those seem like more, like categories that are more stable going back through time. I guess that's a question, not a statement. You know what I mean? I guess that's what I'm asking. Is it a different? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they're more stable because, constructions of race are also based on myths about race, and those constructions have changed, over time. But I don't know if it's more stable, but I will say this, that the kinds of, the fact that you can't kind of retrieve some stories is also very much like, I'm a Caribbean, so I look at text from the Caribbean and its diaspora, and one of the reasons why writers have had to reimagine history is because they have no access to those stories. They don't have access to those stories in history, and they don't even, to some degree, those stories have been suppressed even in their own cultures because the colonizing country still has a huge presence, and really up until the 20th century, most of Caribbean nations didn't get their independence. So when they went to school, they were taught the literature of England if they were from the Anglophone Caribbean. They weren't even taught literature written in their own language, right? Whether it was a Creole language or patois. But I'll just say that I think the same kinds of silences that you find in the queer community, you also find in a community of culturally, ethnically, racially diverse individuals that are also queer, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, to what extent is it okay to reinvent? If it doesn't exist, if it's been lost, if because the categories are not stable, it never even really existed in the first place, is it okay to go back to invent it because we need it for our current cultural and political dignity?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay because, at least from what I come across, a lot of these stories, they acknowledge a trauma that's gone unacknowledged, and for anybody to heal, it has to be acknowledged on some level, right? So in the poem that I wrote, it acknowledges the 1937 massacre. You do a search, you do a Google search on this massacre, and you won't find pictures of it. There aren't any documents. It was very, very suppressed, to the point where a work of fiction came out, I believe it was in 1956, by Jacques-Stéphane Alexis. Then he devotes a third part of one of his novels to reimagining the 1937 massacre. This is in 1956. And how many of you know Jacques-Stéphane Alexis, right? In 1998, a book by Edwidge Danticat, The Farming of Bones, finally dedicated a novel to literally revising history and unearthing some of the names of those victims and some of the stories of those victims, so that they didn't just remain victims, right? But that they could be seen as human beings. So I think it's okay if it's in the spirit of repossessing a past that you have to repossess. There's no other means to repossess it, and if it acknowledges a trauma, right? And if that can lead to healing. And then also, I find that a lot of these stories are also empowering to some communities that might not always see themselves reflected in literature. This is Josh Brown.
Hi. So, I appreciate your patience. It sucks when you're on the way and you get a flat tire and you got to figure out how to get from New London to Hartford. So I appreciate your patience. I love what I'm hearing too, and that kind of made me think about different ways that we digest that information. I think of Watchmen, so for all my nerd Watchmen fans, when they talked about Tulsa and how they revealed that, a lot of people were shocked, like, oh my God, this couldn't have happened. This is just a comic book. And it's like, no, this is when you have, what's it called? Art imitates life. And you're able to really get that, to expand it to a new audience. I think that is really a part of, one, spreading awareness, but you repurpose it around something else and still, point back to these are real things that occurred. And you know, even in the comic books, you know, you're thinking that this is something that could just be absurd. But like I said, I think it's the biggest aspect that art imitates real life, and you're able to spread awareness of those things to people that, you know, in their bubble would have never found out about those events. So I think it is important to, like you were saying, repurpose those things and have to repackage that information so people can receive it.
Yes, and I definitely think for oppressed individuals and minorities, it's a way of taking back their power. Because, you know, not having anything written down because there was someone over you that didn't allow you to do that, well, I wasn't able to do that 50, 60, 70 years ago, but someone today can get that power again.
The question about literature as a means of rewriting history is also a question about representation. I think we started talking about the second question already, actually. What kind of decisions do you debate or wrestle with when shaping a piece of writing and representing a voice, group, or experience? Precisely, I think, because there is that, because of the, writers take liberties, right? And that's, hopefully they take the right ones. But there's all these kinds of issues that come with those kinds of liberties, making those choices. So I'm just interested, if we can even talk about the poems and the work that you brought today, and what went into the shaping of your work. What decisions or choices did you have to make? I can certainly, I would rather give the floor to all of you.
This was what I read earlier today was actually the last essay that I edited. And I was very scared when I was writing it because I was like, I don't want anybody to think that I am an undocumented individual. And it's actually the last essay in the book, so that's clear from the get-go. And the reason that I wrote it in abecedarian form is that there are so many levels to this issue, and I knew that it'd be impossible to write it all in an essay, so I took that liberty to make it into a listicle, and as you heard, I have listicles within this abecedarian. But it's very hard to know whether you're doing the right thing. At the end of the day, I remind myself that not everyone is going to be happy with what I write. But first and foremost, I write for the person that I was 5, 10, 15 years ago. Because, hey, I needed this book that I wrote when I was 15, when I was 20. And I didn't read any books by Ecuadorian Americans. There were Mexican American writers and Dominican American writers, and I loved that. But I never saw myself represented in that. And so it's very hard, and I think that each piece that you work on, you deal, and then you ask yourself, and during the revision process, is this okay? How much of myself am I putting in here? And also, I do hope at the end of the day that when people read the work, they're not like, oh, she represents Ecuadorian people, all Ecuadorian people. I hope that readers acknowledge that we're not all monoliths,
A lot of what you said resonated with me. Whenever I write a poem or I write a piece, it definitely starts off with, personal experiences. I've always enjoyed stories. I've always, when I was younger, loved stories of Nancy the spider, and there's always a moral or a lesson that you're getting out of it. So whenever I do write a piece, most of the time I'm trying to either share a story of something that happened to me, or kind of just really a lesson that I can share with someone else. And it is that same sense of, lessons that I wish that someone had told me when I was younger. Now, when I'm, stepping into other positions and other, areas, I'm learning to start off the inspiration of a personal story, but then think about, okay, what more can I bring attention to? What more can I shed light on? So recently I was on a overdose awareness panel, and I talked about, a time where, I had a bad trip, and it was just a party. But then it made me reiterate, think about how I can start writing from a broader lens of bringing awareness to people that, you know, really are struggling with their pain, they're battling their own mental illnesses, and that really brings me back to, okay, this personal piece is nice, and I can have those, but now I need to start writing from a worldview of really bringing awareness to these things to people. So that's really my process.
For me, like, from the level of craft, you know, I always approach something in a way that I really want to humanize it. You know, I want it to feel familiar to a reader. So in the poem that I read, for example, I'll just kind of mention two things. The title, La cama tiene candela, or The bed is on fire, is actually taken from a bachata song. Written by a bachatero, and bachata is really popular right now, right? But many people might not know that bachata got its really fast-paced beat by the bachatas written by Robin Darío, and he was Dominican Haitian. So it's not a coincidence that I picked like that title for this poem. I really thought about the title, but those are the kinds of decisions that sometimes I make. One of the last images that you get in this poem that kind of changed the direction of this poem is the image of when the narrator says, debating if we were two wings from the same bird or the bird itself. And it's actually an allusion to Cantos de la Frontera, Songs from the Border, by Manuel Rueda. Manuel Rueda is a huge poet in the Dominican Republic, but, you know, not as well known in the United States, but he's one of my top poets from the Dominican Republic. And what's interesting about that is that there's this image, right, where it's a bird singing to the other bird, and they're actually connected by kinship, right? But the meeting together doesn't actually happen in that first poem. He takes this idea and he brings it into a collection of poetry called Macandal's Metamorphosis. And in that poetry collection, he imagines this maroon figure. Macandal was a historic figure that led a maroon rebellion in 1757. And he's usually only claimed by Haitians. In this poetry collection, he's envisioned as essentially this, you know, a tie to both Dominicans and both Haitians. And, you know, Rueda doesn't even stop with just like notions of national identity, right? Meaning he acknowledges an African ancestry in the Dominican Republic and that Macandal is essentially one of our ancestors. But he takes this actually further. This is a character, not a character, but a figure that transforms literally throughout the text into different animals, into different gods, and even at one point he changes into an androgynous god. So that's to say that Rueda is also complicating notions of sexuality and gender as well. So I thought it would be interesting, you know, when I wrote this, you know, you don't know the gender of the narrator, and I did that kind of like as an homage to the way that nobody would know unless I told you. But I think it's interesting to consider how the narrator could be, you know, a different kind of gender, that's something that's kind of unresolved or it's not revealed in the poem. Just like you don't know which one's, which speaker is from Haiti or which speaker is Dominican. And there are other references in the poem where I reference flowers, for example, and flowers from Haiti and flowers from the DR, the national flowers. So these are some of the decisions that I kind of make when shaping something. How can I really kind of bring out the subject, but really humanize it in a way that that personalizes an experience and also humanizes these two nations. Mm-hmm.
You know, when I think of this question, I think about, you know, the sort of act of faith that underlies certainly lyric poetry, I think personal essays too, which is that if you speak about your experience directly, that other people will be able to relate to it, so that you don't necessarily have to generalize about the group that you're identifying with or responding to, that being honest about your own experience will do that work. So the relevant question becomes, how intimate, and I think you touched on this a little bit, Victoria, you know, how much are you going to reveal, how much are you going to sort of tolerate the discomfort of other people knowing, or maybe making assumptions that you're not sure you want them to make. In the poem I read, the Robert Frost Takeoff, it's a dramatic monologue, so I have the extra insulation. But even at the end of that poem, you may remember the horse remembers a man coming to his pasture, a 45-year-old man with sugar cubes in his hand. And that comes directly out of my experience, being a younger queer person with no community. You have a chance erotic encounter that you don't know how to replicate, and it haunts you, right? So that is a sort of personal revelation, and thankfully the dramatic monologue is a screen, but in lots of work you don't have that screen. So, you know, the question isn't to me how much you want to generalize about others, it's how much about yourself do you want to risk other people identifying with, or being like, okay, dude, that's weird, I'm not comfortable with this, right? Like there's both possibilities. So, you know, it's just a question of where you feel that boundary is.
Could I just point out maybe one more person and then we wrap up? Thank you. I know we could go on forever, but yeah, I just wanted to give you an awareness. I hate to be a killjoy.
So we'll just open it up for questions and answers.
I have a question for the whole panel, everybody can take it, about, is there a moment that you experienced an aha moment, either with literature or with quote-unquote history, either with a capital H or a lowercase h, through a text or including an oral text, that made you learn something about your own identity position that was not part of canon, if you will, for you? And I'm asking this question as a non-binary person who only recently found out that there's the hijra in India, there in the South Pacific, in Native American tribes here. There were always third gender people going back thousands of years, and it's British colonialism that suppressed those narratives. It's not that the identity I have now suddenly showed up in the 20th century for the first time. So is there a moment for any one of you where you went, oh my God, and had a revelation like that about yourself through learning some other literature? And what was the text?
I'm lucky. So my mom's a professor of comparative literature, and I was just fed really great books. And when I was in high school, my mom gave me The Kingdom of This World by Alejo Carpentier. And I remember thinking, wow, so this happened? This happened where the Dominican Republic is? When did it become the DR, and when did it become Haiti? And fast forward, that ended up being one of the texts that I wrote about in my dissertation, and the poetry collection that I'm actually working on is on Maroon women. So The Kingdom of This World focuses on, its first part is focused on Francois Macandal, who I talked a little bit about it. He's a pre-revolutionary figure in Hispaniola. And so now I'm actually writing about Maroon women in poetry. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I'm constantly digging to kind of know more about where I come from and who I am, and that kind of questioning. But that was I feel like it happens to me all the time, to be honest, because I really love to identify with protagonists, even if they're protagonists that I seemingly are so different from me. So I just recently taught Marguerite Duras's The Lover, and the way that her feelings about her brother, right? I was like, oh my God, I so identify with this protagonist. Anybody else? Texts that have been that aha moment?
So it's funny because it was more oral, definitely. So it's always little things that I'm hearing about, just shared experiences between the African diaspora. It's a lot of things that we lost in practice because we didn't document it, but things that we just naturally do. So it's when you're finding out that the reason why people snap at poems, at poetry, open mics is because they used to have speakeasies and they didn't want to wake up master. So that's literally like why we learned about snapping. I've learned, the reason why a lot of, individuals that are black laugh and run away is because if we were laughing and too loud in the fields, they would think that we were replanting something. So I think that when I find out those things, that really is like one amazing, because we've been able to, it's sad in a way that, we have a shared trauma that has affected us till today. And at the same time, we have very resourceful traditions that we still pass down. And I think that definitely helps me in a recent piece that I'm writing about my hair. We have all like shared to the down to where we see one product or one comb, and all of us have like a flash of memory. And I think that that's very empowering and very almost like you're connected to a higher place. I think that that's always very important to pass along and talk about, and reconnect with Africa and with our past and our traditions. And same, needing to find those texts and those examples, because even in that, I was able to find a book called Crowns and a book, I can't forget the second book, but it highlights past hairstyles in Africa, and it's the same protective styles that we use till today. And I think that that's the amazing part, when you can reconnect with those. I'm going to remember the other book later, but I definitely always try to orally share that, always try to incorporate that in some of the pieces that I'm writing as well.
I'd like to thank the so much.